if they see. Okay, so it says live, then I click. We're back for a second time. Thank you so much, Dr. McDonald, for joining me today. We are on Wisdom for Our Children, where I get to chat to amazing human beings like my friend Cheryl here, who's going to pass on some wisdom that she's learned in some of her research. And I'm going to dive right back in this because it's round two. So Cheryl, please let us know who you are, where you're from, and what you're all about.
Sure. My name is Dr. Cheryl McDonald. I am originally from Moncton, New Brunswick. I am a sports sociologist, so I have a degree from St. Mary's University, where we met.
Once
a Husky, always a Husky. I have a degree.
I'm having deja vu.
I have a degree in sociology from St. Mary's. I also have a degree, or a master's degree in sociology from Concordia, and a joint PhD in sociology and anthropology from Concordia. I have always studied masculinity in hockey up until now. So that started off as being that idea of sort of toxic masculinity and bro culture, if you will. Lately, lately it has drilled a bit down into homophobia, a little bit more than that. And in the past 2 years, I've started to leave hockey studies behind.
Okay, thank you for saving my question. So I want to start this off by quoting some question that was posed to you in your research that kind of shifted where you were going. You need to figure out why it's not okay to be gay.
Right, so you have pulled a direct quotation from George Laraque. George was an enforcer with the Montreal Canadiens and Edmonton Oilers, among other teams in the NHL. I'm pretty sure he calls Montreal home. When I was doing my PhD in Montreal, my partner at the time, who's also a good friend of yours, met George. And to fast forward a very long story, I end up on the phone with him where I said, listen, I'm starting a PhD. I have 4 years to study masculinity in ice hockey. If you were in my position, what do you think would be important? And that's when he said, you have to find out why it's not okay to be gay. He said that there were gay men in the NHL, their teammates keep their secret, and that it was important to speak to the younger ones about why this culture of silence exists. At the time, through my personal contacts, I had access to about 120 major U18 ice hockey players, young men between the ages of 15 and 18. So I did surveys and interviews with them. They were presumably all straight. None of them disclosed that they were gay at the time. And so I talked to them about what it would be like to have an openly gay teammate, whether or not they thought that it was safe for somebody to be out in their culture. And we had some really great conversations.
What did you draw from those conversations?
The biggest thing that I took away is that they're all different. As you might expect to find in the broader society. I mean, normally we say that sports lags behind society in terms of its progressivism. However, in this case, I would say it was fairly similar to society in the sense that some of these kids were perfectly okay with the idea of having a gay teammate. They were very well educated in terms of like the vocabulary, the social issues associated with the queer community. There were some who were kind of on the fence, didn't really understand queer identities, weren't really sure what it would be like to have a gay teammate because they thought they never had. And then there was the other end of the spectrum where there were some kids who just said, I straight up disagree with it and that wouldn't be okay with me. So that I think is what was most fascinating because this would have been like around 2014, 2015. So it was interesting to see that as a group, they were really all over the board in terms of what they thought.
Did you get a lot of interactions with the parents?
I did not. However, their parents did have to sign waivers to allow them to participate because some of them were most of them were minors. And I did hear through the grapevine, through the coaches, because I think in in most cases, the coaches did have a meeting with the parents to explain who I was, that I was going to be coming into the dressing room and why. And I understood that the parents were sort of similar in their opinions, where some thought it was actually very important for their kids to participate in this research, whereas others disagreed with it. A couple kids weren't allowed to participate. Parents didn't understand why this had to do with hockey, felt that it was actually taking away from their child's, reason to be there, which was to win. So again, from what I heard, despite my lack of interaction with them, all over the board.
Do you think that the way the parents reacted showed in the way the students reacted to working with you and trying to get that information from them?
100%. So, because I'm smart,
Very, by the way.
I put that right in my interviews. I asked the athletes, name the 3 people that you are closest to in life. Who are the 3 most important people in your life? In a lot of cases, it was their father. In some cases, it was their mother. In other cases, it was a teammate or a girlfriend is the word that they would use to describe their partners. And in a lot of cases, when I would say, and how does your father feel about homosexuality? Their opinions would line up with what their dads thought. And in some cases, they were very transparent about saying, well, my father told me that it's wrong, and therefore I also think it's wrong. Or again, because they were all over the board, there were some that were like, yeah, my father makes fun of gay people, has a lot of problems, and that embarrasses me in public. Or at the same time, I also had the kids that were like, yeah, my dad has a bunch of gay friends. I just went to a lesbian wedding with him. It was awesome. So the parents definitely have an impact on those attitudes and perceptions, but in different ways.
Interesting. So you talk about the toxic your research goes from toxic masculinity to homophobia. Where, kind of when you're studying this, do you see the shift and you realize I need to kind of pivot and start looking at homophobia in hockey as opposed to toxic, I can't even say the words, toxic masculinity, and how are they intertwined and related?
Absolutely. That's an amazing question. So what I was finding out is there is this set of traits that we tend to attribute to what I theoretically would call hegemonic masculinity, but I find in the mainstream you hear toxic masculinity, fragile masculinity. I like to use bro culture because it's not just hockey, right? We find it in other sports. We find it in fraternities. We find it in policing, in the military. It's not just hockey all the time. But anyway, of all of the things that I found to describe that culture, a lot of it boiled down to sexuality. And so a lot of times, if you weren't acting according to how they thought you should act, you were accused of being gay. If you were feminized in some way, so if you were being compared to a woman, that they actually kind of meant that you were gay, not that you were necessarily a woman. And there was a lot of having to prove how straight you are and how many women you had been with. And it, in order to make fun of someone, you called them gay, or, and if somebody was different in any way. So I remember hearing a story about some kid on an opposing team that played the violin, and they thought for sure he was gay because he played the violin.
Yeah.
And so it just, the lowest common denominator in that culture always boils down to homosexuality. And I was like, that's kind of weird, frankly, especially where when you actually call them on it, when you say, so why do you keep calling people gay? Why is that your insult of choice? And they go, oh, well, we're not actually talking about homosexuality. We just want to insult them. And I was like, okay, but when you want to insult a Black person, do you just use the N-word, not because they're Black, but because you wanted to insult them? And they're like, well, absolutely not. And I was like, so then, and now you're starting to hear, the other F word, it's not okay to say that 3-letter F word anymore. So I am seeing that kind of change, but no matter what aspect of that culture I was looking at, it kept on boiling down to sexuality. And at that point, I had 4 years worth of research to do, and then went on to do 4 more years of it, because then I started talking to former NHL players about why there are no openly gay men in the NHL. I started finding openly gay men who had competed at elite levels of the game to talk to them about their experiences. And I easily could have kept going. It's just for reasons we can talk about if you want, I got burnt out. And so I ended up leaving it behind.
Yeah, that's. Yeah.
It's
We'll
a
go
lot.
into those after. We'll stay on the topic of. I want to jump into the culture of silence. You know, that's a buzzword I've heard you say. You know, today as well as before on some other interviews. You know, what is it around the culture? You know, because I feel the same way playing football for since 1993. Not to age myself, but everything you're saying, and I'm guilty of saying those words myself, and not even in attacking someone in that, just like, that's the slang word. Oh, that activity is gay, and so I want to talk about the culture and silence, and then how can I, as a father, kind of start breaking these patterns within my own children and making sure that we're not creating these generational things moving forward.
I love that question. So, right. So it's a two-part question. So the culture of silence, it dovetails into the second question, because my very brief answer, I'll give you more, but the bottom line is, in order to change things for your kids, you have to break that silence. So in a lot of cases in sport culture, especially men's team sport culture, so that's hockey, football, basketball, you name it, baseball a little bit too, it's this idea of just not drawing attention to yourself, not being any kind of distraction. And what I found, especially with the former NHL players, is that almost anything is a distraction. So in a way, it doesn't matter if you are gay, it doesn't matter if you're concussed, it doesn't matter if you have an addiction issue, if you are a victim of sexual abuse. The point, like marital problems, doesn't matter what is going on in your life. There is somebody that has your skill set that's coming up behind you that doesn't have that kind of baggage and will take your job. So it's easier for you to shut your mouth, not draw attention to yourself, be quiet, do your job, possibly make your millions of dollars, and then worry about it once your career's done, because it's short, like especially in football, but also in hockey.
I'm going to pivot on that because I think that's a very good point. Do you think that's what's causing a lot of mental health problems in these sports?
Oh, 100%. Straight from a psychology perspective, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a psychologist, not an expert. However, it is so obvious to me that if we aren't letting people be their authentic selves, if we aren't letting people be who they are and celebrating them for who they are, they're not going to perform at their highest level, because they're not able to fully bond with teammates. They're not able to feel safe and comfortable. That starts translating into physical injury, like those psychosomatic injuries. And in a lot of cases with young people, it translates to them quitting sport entirely. So, and especially where, I mean, being gay in 2021 really isn't a bad thing. Like it's not like if you were 17 and still, I don't know, sucking your thumb. Like, yeah, maybe that might be weird to some people. You might want to consider seeing a psychologist, but being gay is not like that, right? So I think that it's everyone else projecting their own insecurities onto these kids and not letting them be themselves, and then the sport experience falls apart. And so, to circle back to your question about how to break that silence and how to handle it as a parent yourself, celebrate your child in all of their uniqueness and their weirdness, and in all of their quirks and likes and dislikes. I mean, absolutely make sure they're a good person. I recommend having control over that. But when anybody, whether they're a child or an adult, when they are celebrated for being their authentic selves and for loving themselves and being who they want, they just become the most positive and beautiful contributors to society. And I think that is one of the best gifts you can give your kid, because a lot of the hockey players that I come across didn't have that. Like when you're in a male team sport, you spend so much time having other people dictate how you can act and whether it's
Mhm.
cool or not, that yeah, your mental health suffers because you can't be yourself, and that causes depression. The science shows
Mhm.
that.
You bring up a really interesting point of like athletes being able to compete at their highest level when they're openly themselves, whatever that is. And that reminded me of the Netflix series of the Chicago Bulls, where Dennis Rodman just had to take off and go party for 6 or 7 days. And they had to send Michael Jordan. Carmen Electra opens the door. It's like Michael Jordan's like, hey, it's time to come back now. But I think that like, Phil Jackson having the fortitude saying like this player needs that to get away. Maybe what he's going to do is not the best thing for his body, but we can't control that human being and that person. And then allowing him to go do that and express himself, come back in, and he's a very expressive person and probably one of the best defenders to ever play in the game. So I think that you
Yes.
bring a very good point.
Well, exactly. And I mean, he's one of the most highly criticized for being so different, right? And I mean,
Yes.
yeah, he is different. There's no getting around that. But I don't think it's an attention grab. I think it's just very cool that he feels he can be himself. And
Mm-hmm.
um I also think that you hit another key point, which is, if especially in hockey, so like for me, if Sidney Crosby or Connor McDavid announced tomorrow that they were gay, like I personally believe that suddenly it would be very cool to be gay because they are such skilled athletes. And so I think it's one of those things where it's like if you're going to put up, I don't know, at least 50 points on a season for us, then yeah, like you sleep with whoever you want. We don't want to hear about it, but you're doing your job.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas if a bubble player comes out, then suddenly you're like, well, is
Mm-hmm.
this a PR stunt? They're not really that good, and it, there's so much criticism. Um, but it makes you wonder, like if that bubble athlete would have been able to be themselves all this time, like maybe they would be the next Connor McDavid or Sidney Crosby. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there are some sports that are more accepting than there are? Because I'm speaking mostly from the culture of football that I've played in for my whole life, and I wouldn't say that it was frowned upon. Like I've never had an openly gay teammate say, I'm gay, and we weren't accepting of that. But I've also had never had a teammate come out and say I'm gay. Do you know what I mean? So I've never been put in a situation where I could see it and reflect on that. But do you notice that there's some sports where they are more open as opposed to, hockey or
Mhm.
football?
So at St. Mary's, I did a study comparing hockey and football, which is where I learned why hockey was so different.
Mm,
But however, to like start broad and then narrow our scope a little bit, individual sports, way more okay to be gay because you don't have anywhere from 20 to 40 teammates policing
true.
your identity.
Or 80.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
And women's sports, way more okay to identify as queer.
true.
Soccer, even men's soccer, I think is a little bit more open-minded because they come
Okay.
from a more European mindset where they're just less judgmental about romance and sexuality and things like that. But to really drill down to hockey and football, because that was, I dated a football player in university when I started this work, and I was always fascinated by your experiences versus my life in hockey. And I had always dated hockey players prior to dating a
Hmm.
football player, so like
Yeah.
the whole thing blew my mind. And um, the football players that I interviewed pointed out a key difference, and that is in the size of the team and the demographics of the team. So, as you said, you can have up to 80 people on a football team. So, chances are you're not going to be best friends with
Mm.
79 other guys.
Yeah. Also on that too, like we're segmented. Like receivers,
You're
O line, DB, receiver, or
exactly.
linebackers, running backs. Yeah, that's a very good point. I
So,
never thought of it like that.
you're not going to have a whole team of people policing your identity who expect you to see the world the same way you do because there are simply too many of you and you're
Mm.
too different. And also, on a football team, you are more likely to have racial diversity, for instance, or ethnic diversity. And I think that causes you to have to understand different identities even more than a hockey team of what, 20 to 25 white dudes that are probably all from middle to upper class backgrounds, because again,
Mm.
we know not
Yeah.
everybody in football is rich. Yes, it can be
Yeah.
expensive to participate, but not everybody's rich. And so I think in football you're in less of a pressure cooker because there are more of you. So you can find more like-minded individuals and not worry about the people who aren't on your page. And also you're already inherently more different from each other anyway. So your baseline already starts with more acceptance.
Interesting. So just to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying because football players are immersed in bigger cultural differences, and usually, like, if you're like, I mean, I played for 25 years. I have, tons of black and brown friends, Asian friends. Because of that, I have more of a higher baseline for accepting people overall.
Yeah, because you're more used to people being different from you from the get-go.
Okay.
And again,
Cool. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, just like to really drive home my other point, let's say somebody on the football team is gay and somebody on the football team is homophobic. Well, first of all, if you don't play positions that even have to interact, you don't have to spend a whole lot of time with a homophobic person. So you can kind of just go about your day and not worry about them. Whereas in hockey, like, that family mentality in the group is so small that suddenly everybody's opinion is kind of in your face and you're expected to share everyone else's opinion, and they call it a team first attitude and team bonding.
True. So just to confirm, the data says football players are better than hockey players, right? I'm just kidding.
I plead the fifth on that.
One thing why I started this podcast was really just, to pass on lessons to my children. So, we're not here forever. We're all here for an infinite amount of time. And the more I'm this is only really episode 3, but the more I'm diving into these, I find that people who are working with purpose are really passionate about what they do. And I think that's really what drove your research for the last, 8 to 10 years, if I'm correct. Maybe more.
13, but who's counting?
13, okay. I don't mind being corrected. That's fine. What's so fulfilling about this work that drives you to continue to do it? And then we'll go into burnout.
But so burnout is kind of my answer. There came a time in both my personal life, because my personal life was also hockey culture, as was my professional life. I was like living in and studying this culture. And I always thought I was on the outside of it because I was a woman and because I was an academic, and it turned out I was quite wrong. I got tired of it. I got tired of how not a whole lot was changing, and change was so slow, and it felt like we would take one step forward, 2 steps back. It felt a lot of the time like nobody cared. Nobody understood why I was so riled up about social issues. And finally, it just felt like I wasn't making I know I was making a big difference. I know my work was important. I know I did so many cool things, but eventually it wasn't enough to get me out of bed to go to work in the morning. So I did a lot of soul searching, made a lot of life changes, and decided I need to do something that makes me feel day in and day out like I'm creating change. And I ended up finding student athlete support and development. So like I'll save that whole story depending on what you want to get into next. But that was just it. I didn't feel like I was doing enough to satisfy myself or to actually change the culture. And that led to burnout, because if you're not happy and you feel overextended and like you're not making a lot of progress, then you don't want to get out of bed in the morning. So I found something that makes me feel a little bit more accomplished. But I still do hockey activism. Like I'm working now with a group that is going to create a queer hockey group, comparable to like Black Girl Hockey Club or the Hockey Diversity Alliance. I'll always do that because they're my friends, and I care about their well-being, and it's a good way to spend time with them. But the research part is done.
You've been on that team for a while, I believe. I think the last time we spoke, maybe 3 years ago, you were playing goalie for them. Is that correct?
Oh, no, different. So back then, at the University of Alberta, in just like the recreational hockey league on campus, we had a queer team where we took anybody who identified as LGBTQ or an ally. And that was such an amazing experience, because we had like rules written on the wall that was like, we're probably all going to be naked together. Do not stare at each other's bodies. Do not ask questions. Like, Doesn't matter if you're straight, gay, whatever, like, get used to this because this is how life should be, and this is where we're gonna force ourselves to get comfortable. And,
Mm,
being a straight white woman, despite the fact that I was an expert, it was a learning curve for me, which goes to show how deeply rooted our biases are.
mm.
But that was one of the coolest experiences of my life. I hurt myself and had to quit hockey, but I mean, other than that, it was great.
Oh, that was a great time. I want to dive into our deeply rooted biases. You're coming, like, I think that's a great point to talk about because, like, I can go about my own cultural biases that I have deep inside myself that I become aware of sometimes, and I'd like to kind of speak to the expert about it and what you learned about yourself and some things that you picked up along the way and how you're changing them.
Yeah. So the most basic example for me was a gender neutral washroom.
Mm.
When I first had to start peeing around men, like, I was a mess. Like,
Mm.
that just wasn't okay. It was not okay. And it's like older men, I was especially not comfortable. Older men who were my boss, like, peeing next to them was just like, this is very weird. Um, but then, you start asking, like, you have to sit down and do that work and be like, okay, why is this weird? Why? But when you have spent your whole life being told not to pee with boys, uh, yeah, that's weird. But then you realize that, like, there's not really a reason for it. And if
Mm.
somebody is trans, imagine how they must feel. I have a friend that was physically attacked in a bathroom the other day, and
Recently.
it was a week and a half ago now in the States. And what's most
Okay.
unfortunate is she's a woman. She was born a woman. She identifies as a woman, but she looks like a man. She's got the short haircut and wears, more masculine clothing. But a woman wouldn't let her in the bathroom and accused her of possibly wanting to sexually assault her daughter by virtue of being in the bathroom. Didn't believe that this person was actually a woman, said she was a man who was lying. Um, and I just, like, my friend just wanted to pee. Like, she offered to
Mm.
pull her driver's license out to prove that she was a woman. And um it goes to show that we have all these fears for different reasons. But in my case, it was just that I wasn't used to it. I had spent my whole
Mhm.
life being told not to pee around boys. And um I eventually got used to it. Yeah, it was uncomfortable at first, but they're really, like, I wasn't afraid for my safety.
Yeah.
Um and and that's just it, is when you're used to doing something for so long, you're probably not going to change overnight, and I get that. But it means we have to do that hard work of being uncomfortable and realizing that sometimes the understandings that we have, um, for no good reason, are causing harm in some ways.
Mm.
And that's just it. Is I now think about what it's like to be trans and using the washroom, because they will literally get beat up.
Mm.
And that certainly has never happened to me.
Is your friend okay?
Yes, she is fine. I think eventually, well, physically she's fine, but I mean, she ended up having to go several hours without being able to use the bathroom. And in the worst case scenario, that causes urinary tract infections and anxiety and things like that. So not everybody ends up being fine.
Hmm.
But yeah, she was okay.
Yeah, I think there's also like a mental aspect to that. It's the fear of having to go to the bathroom later on, and as a straight white man, I've definitely never come across that same problem. And it's like you're sparking thoughts in my mind right now. They're like, you know, like first thing I think of is like, what's wrong with that person? Like, why? What are you so afraid of? Like, to me, if a lesbian or a trans person wanted to use the bathroom I was in, and go ahead. Like that's just how I am. Like I don't understand the fear or the rationale behind that. And I think, like, even in the time we're living in now with COVID, you think we all have different opinions on it, and I don't want to get into that on this, and I don't judge people, but like, we have to stop being afraid of each other. We're
Yes.
we're 7 or 8 billion people in this world, and until the asteroid hits, we're here for a long time.
Yeah.
No
It,
real question, just a rant.
well, but I think you're segueing into, my theme in life lately, because hockey culture has taught me this. I ended up going through a lot of therapy because I realized I lacked emotional intelligence, partly because of hockey culture. but I think that the commonality here is a lack of empathy. I think
Mm,
whether it's COVID, whether it is trans issues, whether it is like, I don't know, people at the grocery store, we're not always good at putting ourselves in other people's shoes and understanding what it's like to be them and the challenges that they face, because we are in a society that is taught to put themselves first and forget the rest. So that lack of empathy, that lack of emotional intelligence, I think makes it easy to be afraid of others, to put others down, and to not want to understand their struggles because we're so worried about our own.
mm, yeah, that's true. Let's talk about your soul searching and what that did. Basically, I want you to kind of walk us through like that timeline of soul searching and how it led to your life changes and how other people can relate to that and kind of maybe draw something from your personal experiences that might help them.
Sure. So before I start, I want to like throw out a warning just in case there's a listener out there that might be triggered by it. My story becomes very dark. And I'm perfectly okay talking about it, but I like to say that up
Fair
front.
enough.
Um,
I appreciate that
I
because I definitely would not have done that. So I appreciate that.
I'm getting better at not just like throwing really heavy information at people and expecting them to be okay.
Trigger warning.
Yeah. I used to think that those were silly. I'd see trigger warning on Facebook and be like, "What?" And then I'd read it and be like, "No, I needed that warning." Uh,
But then you're already
so,
too deep, though.
well, yeah, exactly. But
You're already too deep.
at least you had been warned. So now,
True.
if I'm not in the right headspace and I see trigger warning, I'm like, I don't even want to be triggered. So we'll just keep going. Um, but I was someone who had no real emotional intelligence. I was a very insecure person from a young age. And the way that I handled not being able to regulate my emotions was by convincing myself I was better than a lot of people. I put a lot of people down. I was very judgmental. And as I became an adult, that was especially clear with my romantic partners. Those were the people that I abused most because it was my way of taking out my own lack of self-love on them.
Mm,
Um, and there came a time where I mean, my marriage ended because of my lack of emotional intelligence. I never hide that. Um, there, with my next partner, um, there came a time where our relationship had fallen apart, and I was like up to my eyeballs in an eating disorder. I had gained a ton of weight. My job wasn't going great because of my burnout from honky culture, and I went to therapy. And I had been to therapy before, so going there wasn't my issue. But hearing somebody tell me that perhaps I was the problem in my life and that the reason that my life had been such a struggle was my own fault was a pretty huge eye opener. So I started reading psychology books. I started questioning whether or not I'm a good person. And over the course of that, it became clear that I definitely needed to get out of not my job. I love my job, but I needed to change my research trajectory because the research I was doing was just not fulfilling me. It was making me fairly miserable. And I also realized that me wanting to be more sensitive and more emotional wasn't compatible with a lot of my friends in hockey culture, because in hockey culture you have to be so tough and not show emotion. That, if I was vulnerable, that just didn't compute with them, and they seemed to think that I was soft and weak. When I knew I wasn't. I was actually getting stronger.
yes.
And I was with a partner who also was not very emotionally intelligent, but I had gone to therapy in hopes of fixing my relationship because he had told me I was a bad person. And then my therapist kind of confirmed that. So I was like, all right, I have no options here. I need to change.
Need a second opinion.
Yeah. So I don't like my job. My partner seems to not like me, and I hate myself at this point. So yeah, something has to change. And what ended up happening was I had spent almost a year doing so much work on myself and went back to that partner to say, like, here's everything I have changed. Like, will you work with me to heal? And he told me I was still a bad person and that I was not good enough for him, and that he didn't believe I had changed. Um, and so at that point, to have, the person that your world revolves around tell you that after all the work you've done, I decided it was time for me to leave this earth. I started planning my suicide. And
Mm.
because I'm Cheryl, uh, it was interesting to see how my identity played into that, because you often hear about, someone with a gun or someone trying to hang themselves. But I like sharing this story in a weird way because it really speaks to my unique experience. But I had planned a games night with my friends and my family, and I had written them all letters to inform them. I never sent the letters, but I wrote them telling them, here's the thing, I would like to leave this world on my terms. I want to have a games night with cake and wine, and I'm going to wear a princess dress. And at the end of the night, I would like to say goodnight to everyone, go upstairs to my bed and ingest poison. And I'm okay with this. I'm at peace with this. I can't handle this world. It is too much of a struggle for me. I want to leave it now. And there came a point where my former partner, in the midst of all of this, had disclosed a bunch of stuff to me that I won't share here, but it was extra hurtful. And I ended up calling a suicide hotline, and they told me that I was a victim of psychological abuse from my partner, and that I was placing obviously way too much importance on my former partner and on that person's opinion, which was obvious now, but back then it
Yeah.
wasn't. And so after that phone call, that's when everything changed. And I was like, no, like, I deserve to be here. And that's when I found my new research and like got my health in order, and things have just been pretty positive ever since that.
That's amazing. That's good for you. Like, thank you for sharing that. That's not easy to share. And for some reason, I'm drawn to a post that you made on Facebook a while ago talking about someone gaslighting you and your emotions. Is this tied to that? For some reason,
100%.
for some reason, I remember that post. Yeah.
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 I spent a year trying to fix myself and trying to make amends with that person. And I asked him to come to therapy with me. And he very frequently said, I'm not going to therapy, but you keep going, you keep working. I believe that if you change enough, our relationship will be better, but I'm not participating in this. And I just believed that that was how that worked, that I was actually that screwed up and he was so perfect that this was actually my responsibility. And at the end of that year, um, I I don't know what was going on in his life, but he came to my house and confronted me with, like, here are all the things I have lied to you about over the past year. Here are all the activities that I have been engaging in and haven't told you about. Also, I'm not going to therapy and you are still a bad person. And that was really I couldn't handle it. And that's when I called the suicide hotline, because I started worrying that, like, I wasn't even going to make it to having my party at that point. Um, and that was just it, is when, so gaslighting, to get a bit more academic about it, because that's how I understand things. Like, when things happen in my life, I want to seek out research. I want to understand academically what's happening. Um, so gaslighting is, I mean, it can be a pile of stuff, and it can be your romantic partner, your boss, your neighbor, your parent, a politician, that, first of all, lies to you, says one thing and does the other, will often downplay your personal growth, will frequently, um, excuse me, uh, switch between putting you down, but then sort of building you up to make sure that they say just the enough right things to keep you around, and will also make you think that you're crazy. So when you question things that don't seem right in the relationship, they'll tell you that you're wrong, you misread something, you're not seeing it the right way. Um, and that's what happened to me for a year, because of course, like almost anybody else in my position, I had friends and family who were like, "Do you not see that this guy is terrible for you and that you aren't the problem?" Um, and I didn't believe them. I believed him, and he really, because I had no self confidence, that meant that I had given him the power to really create a false reality in my
Mhm.
own head. And it happens pretty easily that you don't know what's real anymore, and you're so focused on them that no matter what anyone else says, you think everybody else is wrong.
It's a tough situation.
It's very
That's
tough.
yeah. That's I'm sorry. I'm reading my notes here because I don't want to miss this. Where do you think the lack of self-love came from?
At the risk of sounding super ungrateful, my parents.
Mhm.
I want to be so clear about the fact that growing up, I had wonderful parents. My father passed away, but my mom and I have never been closer. She's my best friend. And so I always like to preface because I say a lot of sort of horrible things, but like my mom has been my biggest fan in my eating disorder recovery, in my learning of emotional intelligence and all of that. So I like to start there. However, like a lot of parents in our generation, I was raised using fear, guilt, and shame.
Mhm.
It started off as like, from a Catholic perspective, sort of like if you don't behave, you're not going to heaven. And then it turned into more like if you don't do what I think you should do in life, I will be disappointed in you as a person. And I often felt that I wasn't allowed to be my authentic self. So if I wanted purple hair, or if I wanted to hang out with kids from a different socioeconomic status from mine, or if I was questioning religion or things like that, my mom especially would often sort of be like, "Why can't you just fit in? Why can't you just be normal? Why are you so weird?" And I went into the world asking myself why I'm so weird, and then I went into a hockey culture that made me feel weird, and I
Mhm.
attracted more people. I became a goaltender partly because it's okay for goalies to be weird in hockey. They're the ones who don't get questioned much. Um, so
Yeah.
I just didn't love myself, and I didn't think that I was good enough, and I carried that with me all of my life.
Wow. Do you
Yeah,
still do you still have that relationship with your mom, or do you think she's changed as well over time and evolved?
we have both changed. So my mom is getting way better at not criticizing every little thing about me. And I know that when she would criticize me, it was because she wanted what was best for me. She wanted me to be successful. She wanted me to not be a criminal. Like,
Yeah.
it's just that, she had also been raised by parents who just like pointed out everything that was wrong with her most of the time. And unfortunately, even though my parents often pointed out things that were good about me, we hang on to the negative. It seems to outweigh the positive for
Mm,
humans psychologically because it's a protection thing. It's a defense mechanism. You want to remember the negative so that it doesn't happen again.
yeah.
Um, However, as I have gone through therapy and learned not to criticize others, because that's what I brought into some of my friendships, but also my romantic relationships. The same way my mom would put me down, I would do that to my partners, and that wasn't fair to them.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, mom, she's very interested in what I'm learning in therapy and which psychology books I'm reading. And she's even noticing now that she's using some of those emotional intelligence tools in her own relationships with her friends or her sister or my brother. And she's able to have more positive relationships with people. So it has, I hate to say this, but me wanting to kill myself, and me acknowledging that my mom wasn't always great, has actually led to beautiful growth. Um,
Mhm.
and I don't always believe that everything happens for a reason. I don't think I should have wanted to kill myself, and I don't think I should have been raised in a household where it wasn't okay to be my authentic self. Um, but I do know that had those things not happened, I wouldn't be here today with all of the knowledge that I do have on how to make the world a better place either.
It's very interesting how everything's coming full circle. Like
Yeah.
your unauthentic self at home growing up leads you to research players not being their authentic self. I think that's fascinating. So I want to tie in, how you transition from your research into new friends and how those two are tied together. So maybe talk about what you're doing now and how you had to shift friends based off their mindset of how cultural.
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying?
I do. I mean, I stopped using homophobic language probably long before lots of other people, but I will say it was, when I first started at St. Mary's, I called things gay. I would call men Nancy and ask them where their purse is when I thought they were being weak.
Yeah.
So it wasn't all that long ago.
Yeah, it's funny.
And I'm not proud of it. Cancel culture would dictate that I shouldn't have a voice right now because I participated in that. But that was all I knew in hockey culture was not only, to make fun of people who were emotional and who were sensitive, but also when it comes to this is a whole other podcast episode, but when it comes to identifying as a woman, what it means to be pretty enough for a hockey player, what kind of woman a hockey player is interested in. A lot of those were rules that I had for myself that were simply unattainable. And so I didn't have self-confidence in a lot of ways, and I let myself be used too by a lot of men because I didn't have that confidence. But it meant that there came a time when I couldn't reconcile my new belief system with a lot of the friends that I had because, I know I had some friends that thought that, for instance, my post about gaslighting or my post about, listen, emotionally, I'm not having a good day today. Like they see that as me wanting attention or me being weak or like whatever, when it's like, no, I'm strong enough to say these things out loud when like you're probably just upset that you're not allowed to be vulnerable. You're probably, upset that you're still existing in a world where you can't be your authentic self and I'm out here doing it.
Yeah, I want to touch on that point before you move on, because I think you bring up a very good point of like, I think some people don't realize that like social media is the new norm. So that is where you're going to express yourself, and where people might see it as attention-seeking behavior, and I've been guilty of that too. Like, what are people saying? And I find like I'm more judgmental to the people I know the best. Where I'm more empathetic would be someone like you, who we have, we met in the class. We've known each other for many years. We always try to see each other, like when I come to Halifax, but we're not best of friends. You know what I mean? We don't hang out. We don't send each other Christmas cards. But I think we're more empathetic towards that. And it's funny too, because like even when like you're like when I'm starting this podcast, the people who I don't know the best are the biggest supporters. Like, you're doing a great job, and the people the very best, your longest friends, are like, oh, great, or my siblings. They're like, great job.
But so it sounds to me, and again, I'm not a psychologist at all, but it sounds to me like you probably express your love for others, and the people around you probably express their love for you in that same critical way. They have higher expectations of you. You have higher expectations of someone else. And it's not that they don't love you or care about you. It's just that they take for granted your emotions. And it's sort of like, well, I don't really care what everybody else is doing. I care what Joe's doing. And that's just how we learned that tough love is the best love. That I think our generation learned that, right? And so we're tougher on the people closest to us because we feel they can handle it, and because we have higher expectations because we want them to do well. We want to see them succeed. It's just that doesn't work for everybody. For some people, you're actually just drilling their self-confidence into the ground, and I mean that translates into sports, right? You always, well, not always, but in a lot of cases, you have like that really tough coach, and then it's like the good cop, bad cop, right? You have that assistant coach who's really nice and pats you on the back when you screwed up, and it's like, you'll get them next time, like, and they're your biggest cheerleader. And I think you have to have that balance because some athletes respond to that tough coach, but some don't at all, right?
Yeah.
And so I think the way that we love the people closest to us is kind of similar.
Interesting. Very interesting point. Don't psychoanalyze me. It's not allowed.
It's so too late.
How
But that's the thing.
important?
I mean, it's in like, yeah, sure, I'm analyzing you, but I'm also taking you where you're at, because none of us is perfect. All of us
No.
is at a different place in this journey, and and like, I'm just, I'm excited to see your growth, because the fact that you're doing this podcast to me is growth. The fact that you want to have this conversation with me is growth, and the fact that you acknowledge that you weren't always like this. There was a time, when we were younger, that someone would have been like, "Oh, toxic masculinity in hockey," and you would have been like, "No thanks, bud." Like, so, so like as a human, it is my job to take you where you're at and celebrate where you're at,
Mhm.
and be your cheerleader. And so yeah, don't worry about the analysis.
Well, I definitely appreciate that, and I think like where that comes from is having children. You want to see the world a
Mhm.
better place, and I think all the time, like, what if my child identifies like this when they grow up? I want to make them okay to come out to me. I want them to be, I want them to be loved no matter what, and by
Yeah.
me and by their friends and by society.
Well, exactly, and that was something that I didn't feel I had as a child. It became clear to me early on that it would be easier to lie to my parents, and it would be easier to lie to my friends about certain things. Like, I remember when I got married, I wanted to wear a purple wedding dress. And do you know how many people lost their minds that I wanted to wear a purple wedding dress? And to me, it was like, it's my favorite color. Like, what are we doing? So,
Yeah,
but it caused a lot of arguments, and that's a pretty small thing compared to, like, by the way, I am trans, right? Like,
yeah.
so people are pretty set in their ways. But I think it's about always making sure that your kids or your family, your friends, whoever, understand that you will love them no matter what, and they have value no matter what. So yeah, you might get very upset at them. You might get very disappointed with them. You might feel betrayed by them. They might have broken your trust, but it doesn't change the fact that you love who they are.
Hmm.
And I think, had somebody said it to me that way, that, like, yeah, I'm gonna mess up and it's gonna suck, but my parents will never, like, disown me for who I am. Um, I mean, maybe I would have felt more comfortable being honest and
Hmm.
being myself. And so I think that's just it. Is And I imagine that's hard because I'm not a parent, so it's real easy for me to sit here and say, just tell your kids you love them no matter how much they screw up,
Yeah.
because they're going to screw up hard. They are. We did.
Oh, for sure. For
uh,
sure.
but I think that's the bottom line, is making sure that they feel safe and comfortable with you, and know that if they do screw up, like, sure, you're not going to be happy, and
Hmm.
they're not always going to make choices you agree with, but it doesn't change how you feel about them as a person.
You're right. Okay, so I'm going to end this talk. I have two questions for you. The first one's new. I've never done this yet, but I used to do this in interviews with people. What book are you reading? What's the last book you read, or what book are you reading right now?
I think I have it just behind my laptop. Yes,
Okay.
I do.
Ooh, good one. The Narcissism Epidemic.
So I became interested in, you know, if you're always doing self-care and always trying to love yourself and always trying to tell people that it's okay for you to be your authentic self, like, is there a limit to that? Is there a limit where you just become self-centered and egotistical, and you're not open to criticism? Like, you
Mm.
actually, in attempting to love yourself, have become a bad person. uh, so, like, it was something that I was thinking about, and I was also thinking a lot about, why do people lack so much empathy? Like, why is it so hard to
Mm.
let a trans person into a bathroom? Like, why can't we put ourselves in someone else's shoes? And so my therapist had recommended that book. It's by Jean Twenge and Keith Campbell. Um, and I'm about 3/4 of the way through it. And it, it's saying probably what I should have known it was going to say, is that there's got to be a happy medium. It's important to love yourself, but not to the point that you think you're so much better than everyone, and that you don't have a role in contributing positively to society, and understanding that yes, you're unique and you're special, but you aren't necessarily God's gift to everybody, right?
Mm, yeah,
So you know, finding a balance between having confidence, loving yourself, but also understanding that you're not necessarily better than everybody. And so it's been a really cool book.
interesting. Okay. Last question before you end it. If you could go back in time and tell your younger self something, what would that something be? And what age would you go back to?
Well, I mean, I won't repeat the whole speech, but it would be that bit about, you know, you're going to screw up and there are going to be hard times, but it doesn't mean that you don't have value as a human. You know, it doesn't mean, and especially on things like, you know, when I wanted purple hair when I was younger, like when I was like 9, I think. Um, yeah, people might look at you funny for having purple hair, but that's kind of their problem. There's something in other people that makes them react negatively to you because they're projecting whatever weird stuff is going on in their head onto you because having purple hair is not a bad thing. So I'm understanding that if you're a little different, um, it doesn't always mean there's something inherently wrong with you. Um, Gosh, when would I have wanted to be told that? I think probably middle school. I think you can tell kids that from birth basically, but I think it's probably not until middle school that they really start realizing that maybe there's something different about them, or maybe their friends, you know, don't have the same lives that they do and they're starting to have their own opinions. And in middle school, they're also starting to have attitudes. Um, and I know you know that. And yeah, so maybe middle school, I feel like that's when it really should have been driven home because that's when I started feeling most insecure about myself.
Well, Doc, thank you so much for your time today. I think this is an amazing conversation. You bring a tremendous insight on the toxic masculinity in hockey, and I love your research. And I'm going to definitely I'm hoping that you'll come back on again and we can chat again.
Absolutely, because I'm gonna be working with university student athletes, so that's going to be a whole other adventure coming up.
All right. Well, if you ever need to psychoanalyze me, let me know. I'll be a willing participant. And I
Absolutely,
challenge you to put some purple in your hair
I will. I have. I'll keep doing it. I love
forever.
it.
Thank you,
All
everyone,
right.
for listening. Where can people find you in your research if they want to look you up?
Oh, this is my dog. I am so sorry.
For some reason, I want to say his name is Sam.
It's George.
George. Okay. I, I knew he had a human name.
We went the whole episode without him walking in front of the
Hi,
computer.
George.
But to find me, I'm always on social media, so Instagram and Twitter under Dr. Cheryl Mack. That's probably the I am so sorry.
No worries. I love it.
It's probably the best way to find me.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. I appreciate your time. Wisdom for Our Children, YouTube, and Wisdom for Our Children on Instagram. You guys all have a wonderful day.